So bone conduction. So we have, two kinds of hearing. We are hearing through the air. Essentially, sound is coming in through this ear canal, being converted into neural signals through these bones, little bones of our ear and tympanic membrane. But the crazy thing is, of course, our bones also can turn stuff into pitch. And that is because the nervous system is absolutely full of redundant systems. There's always a way. And so we have this great evolutionary capacity to have many paths to the same outcome. And so the famous story is Beethoven, who put the rod in his teeth in the piano to compose the Ninth Symphony, etc., listening through his teeth to be able to write Freude, schöne, gute Funken. He did that through bone conduction. So the bone conduction test, a bone conduction test, is just that same tragus plugging, and you can hum with that. And you can do the other side. Is there a perceived louder internal sensation when you do that? And I'm always noticing autonomic. So just as one side, hey, Jan, you made it. I'm always noticing if one side is more vibrant than the other on that. And is there any difference in stuff like salivary production, which would imply getting into parasympathetics versus dry mouth, which would be getting into sympathetics? And you can even try doing some singing like that, whatever phrase you want to do. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say, and try the other side. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say. Does one side feel better than that?
Yeah, I definitely feel like the right side is almost more like tinny,
Mm-hmm.
and the left side is more lush.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that goes back to that first slide with the cochlea to be what would tinny imply? Tinny implies higher overtone hair cells activating, which if you have threat on one ear, it's going to be that tinny quality over there because your brain's like, oh, I don't know about this. Whereas that really lush, plump kind of sound, that's going to be the side that you're like, I got it. I'm doing great on that. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so for for you, Christine, you'd be like, a good reassessment is, does the tinniness go down in the bone conduction on the right? That would be a sign of being on the right track, I think, for you in terms of auditory nerves.
Mm-hmm.
It's cool.
It's so cool.
Yeah, it's great. You can feel that. So
So
this,
I wonder if that's partially why sometimes I can be flat is
yeah,
with that, like everything that's going on in my right ear.
absolutely, right? So if you have already a predisposition to a lot of higher overtone, your brain's going to be like, don't do that. I'm already
Mm-hmm.
stressed. And so it's going to tend to be under
Mm-hmm.
because your brain's trying to find autonomic balance, right? And this is not in the slides, but just so we know, so the right ear is supposed to be the fast ear in terms of auditory processing because of the vagus nerve and its different lengths on both sides. So it's much shorter
Mm-hmm.
on the right. That recurrent laryngeal nerve is way shorter on the right side. So when the right ear has a bit of a not so happy thing and it's already got a lot of high overtone, that I would expect the tendency to be to sing under pitch when that is the history.
Mm-hmm.
So just kind of cool to think about that. Yeah, Jan?
So I've
Question.
got I've got a kid, I've got a
Hey.
kid who sings flat, but we worked on his breath the other day and it got more in tune. But the
Good.
question is, he can't necessarily hear it nor necessarily feel it. So this would be something a test I could do with him to see
Absolutely.
where the problem is, which I sent him to
100%.
the clinic to get his ears retested, although they're not going to test for what I'm looking for. So
Right.
this is really helpful.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
then the next slide is what I always do, Jan, with
Okay.
someone like this. So this is the drill I do with so let's go through it together. So we have air conduction and bone conduction, and when pitch is a thing, bone conduction is essentially being processed lower, which is why when you hear yourself back on a a recording or whatever, it can sound higher to your ear because you're hearing it only through air conduction then, whereas when you're speaking all day long, you're hearing partially through bone conduction as well. And so amplifying either the air conduction or the bone conduction on either side will usually help you figure out what's going on with the person with their intonation stuff. So you take whatever phrase you're assessing. I'm just going to use "If I Loved You." And then you start by doing a full air conduction and full bone conduction. Now, this is where your coach helps, because when you go into bone conduction, you're not going to be able to judge it super well. So there are levels of bone conduction. So this one, when we're like this, is really a lot of bone conduction. When we're cupping this way, it's still going to do that, but not as intensely. So this is like a dose or a load thing. So this is going to amplify air conduction. This is going to amplify bone conduction, and we're just going to see what happens to your voice. So try both sides first. So cupping like elephant ears like this. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say, how does that feel? And then you go the other way. So the curve is like this. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say. And then once you've assessed that, you do one side at a time. So we're going to let's start with our right ear. So go ahead and cup it up. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say. Other side. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say. Let's talk about that much before we do the bone conduction version. I had a pretty interesting response that matches my pattern. Christine and Jan, how was that for y'all?
So I was better cupping to the front on my right side than my left.
Yep.
And when I did both, it was better when I was cupping this way than this way.
Cool. I'm excited to try this now with you. Jan, how was that for you though?
Right side was clear as a bell. Left side felt like I was in a little bit underwater.
Yeah, you and I have the same pattern, Jan.
It
That's
was
that's our
weird.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's my pattern too. But I felt a lot better when I was actually amplifying the side that likes to shut down for me. So it felt a lot better vocally when I had my underactive side coming into some activation.
So
So
which your underactive side is right or left?
my left side is underactive.
It's like,
Yeah. The
yeah.
underwater feeling, Jan, what that is it's the high overtone not being present. So what Christine has going on is sort of like an overactive sympathetics on the right, but the other pattern that you and I have is a depressed high overtone, and it will feel like that underwater kind of feeling. Let's try this now though. So let's do bone conduction. So if we take the hand cupped like this, let's start with our right ear. So let's sing the same pattern, the same passage like that. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say. And let's switch that. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say. I mean, super asymmetrical for me, very, very different side to side. How is that for you?
Yeah, mine too. And so I'm opposite.
Okay.
So for this one, this side is much more successful than
So,
this side.
so then we mix and match. So now, Christine, you're going to do this and that. So
Okay.
you're going to do,
So this one's coming
yep,
this way.
air
So ones
conduction,
that
bone
were
conduction.
high payoff is where
Correct.
I'm going.
You put the high payoff ones together.
Okay.
So let's try that. I'm going to do the same, which was this pattern for me. So I'm the opposite of you. If I loved you time and again, I would try to say, well, I'd like to sound like that more. That's definitely better for me. How was
Yeah.
that?
Then I don't have to worry about anything.
It's so cool, right?
Yeah.
So this in one slide, in my opinion, answers a lot of intonation stuff. And it's not just this, as Jan said perfectly, can breath training help your intonation? Of course. There's lots of other things that can help it, but I tried to make one slide that people could just use and be like, if I have someone not singing in tune, if I just take them through this sequence, I am sure to learn something about them at least. And I'm having done this with at least 1,000 people, I will say that it usually points towards something. and it gives them something to take away to be like, hey, practice like this for a couple weeks and let's see what happens. Because even just in our small sample here, there's obviously asymmetries going on for all of us. No one's symmetrical. So we just have to have a sense of how to work with it and to have something simple and understandable that's like a practice thing. Any
Mhm.
questions about that? Because to me, this is really like probably the most important thing tonight is this concept.
This
Yeah.
I'm on board with. This on both sides is really damped,
Yeah. Well,
really damped.
and that's what I'm saying, Jan. Like that's where like me listening to you is useful because sometimes it's damped in a way that's bad, but sometimes you will feel like, ooh, that's really weird, and yet out here it might actually be good. So that's really why we need the coach, is because this one is causing you to rely on bone conduction, which we just learned you don't like to do, that you like to use air conduction, right? So that's also good for, for me as your coach, it's good to know that, to be like, okay, bone conduction is a little threatening, air conduction's like really high payoff. And yet we need bone conduction because it's funny how these themes always show up. So I was doing a session right before this with a singer I've worked with for a little while, but had not really gotten to this topic. And I was doing some bone conduction stuff with her. And she said, I never, ever feel anything in my face or anything like that.
Mm.
She's a classical singer who's trying to transition to musical theater, and she was like, people been telling me for years, like, do you feel that behind your eyes or whatever? And she's like, I feel nothing in that area. And so what I did with her was a lot of sensory stuff in the area, because I'm like, okay, that just tells me that you don't currently rely on bone conduction at all, you're only relying on air conduction. And while that's fine, when we started to actually work on sensory stuff in this area, she was like, that is a sound that is unfamiliar to me, but feels amazing. And I
Mm.
was like, that's a cool way to say it. She was like, I've never felt that, but I can tell it's right because I don't feel pressure in my throat. And I'm like, yeah. And it sounded way better outside. So anyway, yeah, go ahead, Jen.
So those kids who, or those singers who you're trying to find any sort of resonating vibrations, hard palate, wherever,
Yes.
this
Yes.
this bone conduction thing
Yes.
could really help them start to figure it out. Because
Absolutely.
I had one guy years ago who couldn't feel anything in his mouth, nothing. And it was like his sound was so, and I
Yeah.
couldn't, I thought, well, Voce Vista, I'll do Voce Vista, but
Sure.
I'm not a statistician kind of person. So
Okay.
that was
I'm,
not for me.
I'm not really either, so I get it. Yeah.
So this is wonderful as an option that
Yeah.
doesn't include that. So
Yeah.
I'm going to try this on both
Great.
of those guys. So thank
Sweet.
you.
Well, it's important to say one more thing about it. So remember that we are survival creatures. And so whenever we can't feel something, that is usually because consciously your brain's like, I'm fine, I'm going through my day. But your reflexive brain, something might have happened along the way. And your reflexive brain decided, well, that sucked. So I'm going to turn all of that sensation down in that area. So I don't feel that ever again. That
Mhm.
numbness. I mentor a teacher who said to me many years ago, and it stuck with me. She was holding her 4-year-old's head. It was like in her lap, and he was talking. And she wrote me and she was like, oh my God, his whole head is vibrating. Like everything is vibrating as he talks. And she's like, I touch my head and it's like completely dead. And I was like, yeah, I mean, life's a full contact sport. This person's had a couple concussions. And she was like, I have no conduction in there. And his head is like just vibrating. And I'm like, yeah, it's the natural state of human bones is to do that. But life happens and we turn that down. So having empathy for those students who can't feel it, you're like, well, just that they've been through something that has their brain has decided it's better to not feel that. And so we have to have that, I think, that lens coming into the work so that we care for them and also acknowledge that that's just part of being alive. But then we got to figure out what system can we engage so that they can feel that. And this is certainly, it is my go-to starting option for that particular topic.
It seems very cyclical too, in the sense that um, when and especially like smart people, when we're flat and when we're good, I played French horn
Yeah.
I know music and could read music really well. But then when I would sing flat, it wasn't just about, then getting anxious and not getting airflow. It was about me then listening more or trying to like listen more. And then that is making me more flat because
Correct.
I couldn't hear it. And
Yes.
then me listening more was throwing me off of breath. So it
Yes.
wasn't even like the breath necessarily being it was definitely involved, me not having
Yes.
the breath under it. But I didn't have the breath under it because then my brain went to trying to hear something more that I just couldn't hear.
Amen. So one of the first slides I do in my class that Jan has taken is I do nervous system's a loop. And so if you just remember that simple statement, the nervous system is a loop. And so any place I jump into that loop could fix it, but we have the easiest job of anyone because we have our singing voice. It cannot lie to you. So when
Mm.
it is better, you have jumped into the loop appropriately. When it is worse, you are on the wrong target. And that makes it so, frankly, easy and joyful because you're like, all I have to do is just understand that it's a loop. I have to understand the anatomy. And obviously, that's why we're here tonight. But then to go, once I get that, like, I'm good. I can just jump into the loop and see what happened. And that's, to me, why I could never, ever be bored with singing because it's the most fascinating assessment of the nervous system loop that exists.